Hello and welcome to Veterans of the Valley. I'm Tom Turbyville. John Milholland was uncertain of his career path when he was a youth. He thought about being a preacher, about being a Boy Scout leader. Then he and a buddy started watching aircraft, watching them land, watching them take off from Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma, and he was hooked. Went home, told his wife he decided to be a pilot. He was going to join the Air Force and he was going to fly. Let's fast forward to 1965 when he graduated as second lieutenant from OTS in San Antonio. In March of 1966, he was a fighter pilot, a Top Gun, strapped in the back of an F-4. Christmas Day, 1966, Lieutenant John Milholland arrived in Da Nang, a hotspot of the Vietnam War. Lieutenant John Milholland, welcome, and thank you for your service. First off, we've set the stage for your story in Vietnam. You take it from there.
Well, Tom, first of all, I wanted to say what an honor it was to be here and be part of this program, and I appreciate being asked. It's hard to go back these 30-some-odd years and remember all the details, but many of the things stick very strongly in your mind, and I'll try to hit the highlights with you. I arrived in country at Da Nang on Christmas Day, or actually the day before on the 24th. And the ironic thing about that was that Bob Hope had his Christmas show at Da Nang on the 24th and came to Saigon on the 25th. And so I passed him in the air and missed the entire Bob Hope Christmas show. So I never got to see it live, but I always enjoyed those. But arriving in country from then until a fateful day in April, we were flying F-4 missions over North Vietnam. I had 66 missions over North Vietnam when in April of 23rd of 1967 was just a normal day. We got up, we had a mission over North Vietnam. We were going to be what we call a CAP mission. And basically what that was, the F-105s, the Thunder Chiefs, did most of the striking at the bridges and the infrastructure of the north, and they were not quite as agile as the F-4s, so we flew what we called cap over the top of them. While they were down dropping their bombs, we would actually fly over the top of them to protect them from MiGs and anything that might be a threat to them from the air.
I want to stop you right there, because what I'd like to do is go to some pictures so people can get an idea, sort of a visual of what we're talking about here, as far as we've got you with your airplane and some other shots from you in Da Nang, at your base in Da Nang. So here's the first shot of a young Lieutenant John Milholland there. I guess that's in front of your
young
F-4,
and slender, and standing in front of a F-4C model. Later editions include the E and the F model in the F-4.
So this was in 1967. Let's move on. I think we've got a shot that you took from your porch, right?
This is a picture of the base there at Da Nang, taken from the front porch of my hoots. The Officers Club would be down on the left at the far end of the street, and the theater was directly across the street.
And we'll move on. Now you get a really idea of just the pure size of this aircraft.
It's hard to understand when people talk about fighter aircraft, the size of the actual aircraft. The F-4 could actually carry more bombs than the B-17s of the World War II era. They carry actually 17 500-pound bombs in a complete load.
And then we got one more picture. There you are in front of the Officers Club.
Yeah, we joked about the only Officers Club in the world open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So
wow.
Quite a place.
That gives people a little bit of the idea of the visual of where you were in 1967. Yes. Now continue about this mission in April.
Well, it was a normal mission, North Vietnam. We were doing the cap. Just as we got in the target area, we got a call from Big Eye. Now, Big Eye is an AWAC aircraft that was flying out over the South China Sea, and they actually monitored the air battle over North Vietnam. And they called up and told us this Big Eye on guard. They had two unidentified aircraft taking off from an airport in North Vietnam, and that they were headed our direction. We immediately, at that point, pull the aircraft up and jettison the centerline tank that we were carrying so that we could maneuver more rapidly, and started searching for the MiGs. When we had started out the day, we'd actually been a 4-ship, but one of the aircraft had to return to the name because they had mechanical problems. So we had three F-4s in the flight. Lead.
And where were you situated?
We were number 4.
Okay. There
There was lead, and then 2, 3, and 4. So 2 had gone home. When the 2 MiGs came in, they immediately realized, the MiGs did, that this was not 105s but F-4s, and they refused to stay and fight with F-4s. So one of the MiGs broke low and into the weeds, and the next one broke high and into the sun, thinking that they could evade us. And it was actually a good day in that situation because both of the MiGs were shot down. Lead and 3 got a confirmed kill of a MiG that day. And as we were flying just northwest of Hanoi over the Red River at a little town called Yen Bay, we were about 8,500 feet, and it was sort of a congratulatory party over the radio as we were telling everybody great deal and how everything was going well. And all of a sudden, I told you that it reminded me of when I was in high school. I was driving down the highway and I ran over a dog, and I felt this tremendous bump on the road, and then I stopped, and I couldn't find anybody that owned the poor dog, so I had to take it home and bury it. But here I am flying at 8,000 feet in an F-4 going 450 miles an hour, and felt a bump, and the first thought in my mind was, where did that dog come from up here? So it didn't take me long, though, to realize that it was not a dog, but that we had been hit by probably an 85 millimeter shell. And what the North Vietnamese would do is they would simply see an airplane coming, and they would send 2 or 3 shells up into the sky, hoping that they would get close enough to hit an aircraft.
So you were at a fairly low altitude here.
Yes, we were at that point. We had gone down chasing the MiG down toward the ground, and so we were climbing up from about 500 or 600 feet when we actually got to about 8,000 feet, and that's where we felt the thump. Of course, we were still flying in a 2-ship. And immediately after we got hit, we started, there were two folks in the aircraft, and we started looking around to see what kind of systems were being affected. We got the burners lit, and we got the nose up, got the aircraft trimmed, so it was in a climb. And the other aircraft, of course, came back behind us and was monitoring our aircraft. Mm-hmm. They flew up underneath us, and they were calling out to us, you've got 4 basketball-sized holes in the bottom of the airplane, you've got 3, and on and on and on, trying to help us understand what the situation was. But at that point, we were still in the Red River Valley, and our objective was to get to it was to the northwest, up over the mountains, up out of the Red River, so that we could, when we had to go out, if we did have to eject, we would be up over the mountains and hopefully a little safer than we knew in the valley. So we were able to climb, and as we continued our climb, the aircraft started to come apart, basically. Just before we had to eject, I remember the only control we had was with our rudders, and I had both of my feet on the right rudder to keep the aircraft from rolling. And finally, the other aircraft that was now following underneath us finally called out and said, hey, you guys are burning bad. You've got to get out of it. So at 28,000 feet, we made the decision to eject. And at that point, if you can imagine the wildest carnival ride you've ever been on in your life, and you multiply that by 10, that's exactly what the ejection was like.
Wow.
As I reached down and pulled up on the ejection handles, there is actually a cartridge in the seat that fires, and then a rocket lights, and you are sent on a really wild ride. Of course, at 28,000 feet at 280 miles, or 280 knots indicated, we were actually making probably, 300 miles an hour. And as I hit the slipstream, my shield on my helmet shattered. And after I had an opportunity to understand what was happening, I thought I was bleeding to death, but I had just minor cuts all over my face. Luckily, I had my eyes closed, so I guess I was prepared for that. But here we are now in the ejection seat, and I'm falling. And in the F-4, you're in a Martin Baker seat, which you were actually strapped into the seat, and your parachute is actually encased into the ejection seat. And you stay in the seat as you fall. You don't come away from the seat. And now I have to fall from 28,000 feet down to where the parachute is supposed to open between 10 and 12,000 feet.
But you're dealing with some mountains now.
And as I'm falling, I'm looking around, and this is unbelievable, but some of the mountains are 12,000 feet tall right where I was going down. And I kept thinking to myself, I've got to do something. I've got to do something. I'm going to hit a mountain. And luckily, my brain caught up with me and reminded me that everything had worked properly so far. There was no reason to do anything stupid. And so I stayed right with the seat, and just about that time, the next thing I knew, the lap belt opened, I was ejected out of the seat, and I was hanging in the parachute. And that was very mild compared to the actual injection out of the aircraft. So
you
now,
were feeling better about things.
Right now I'm feeling pretty good. But as I go through all of the things that they train you, and they beat these things into your mind so that you almost do them automatically, I get all prepared for the landing. But they forgot to tell us that where we're going to land is not going to be that nice, soft sand that we used for training. So as I'm looking down below me, I see just a jungle, totally green. And as I came down, the last thing that I remember as I was coming down in the parachute is a sound of a ripping noise, and I tried to look above me, and I saw my parachute actually caught in a tree, and then I sort of tumbled down and ended up on the ground. Only later did I realize that I had been unconscious for about 30 minutes, as I probably had fallen through the trees at a lot greater impact than I thought initially. But as I hit the ground, in my mind, I immediately jumped up to my feet. I reached down, took out my survival radio, and started talking to the aircraft that was still circling overhead. And his first comment was to me, "Where have you been?" And I said, "I've been right here." I said, "I'm talking to you." He said, "Yeah, but it's been 30 minutes. I said, "No, it hadn't. I just hit the ground." So we had a small conversation there, and he's trying to get me to relax and remember my training. And as we're talking, and he's talking to me on the radio, the first thing that comes to my mind and how things will affect you is I look over, laying over beside me is a little one-man yellow life raft. It's about this long. And in my little panic there, I thought, oh my gosh, somebody's going to see that. The Viet Cong will see it. They're going to come and get me. So I take out a machete and I chop this thing up in little pieces, and I cram it under this big log that I'm laying on. And then I turn around and I look up, and hanging above me is a great big orange and white parachute hanging in the trees. And I thought to myself, now, Lieutenant Milholland, you've got to get control of yourself. And so I sat down, and I took one of the baby bottles that I had in my flight suit. And we use these, I'm denying BX, so more baby bottles than any place else in the world, because we always carried baby bottles full of water so that we'd have a drink of water on some of these long missions.
Yes.
So I sat down and I had a drink of water, and I started evaluating where I was and what I was doing, and I finally looked around to see where I was, and I was on a little clearing about as big as this set, and I knew that I was fairly high on the mountain. Later on, I learned that I was about 7,500 feet on the side of a mountain. And I walked over and looked off the ledge. It was about 2,000 feet straight down and about 1,000 or so feet directly above me. So I had landed.
So you weren't going on a hike of any kind?
I was not going too far anywhere. The guys in the other aircraft, of course, relayed to me that the helicopters were leaving actually Thailand and were on their way to come and pick us up. And the relax saved my radio, and that they would be there as quickly as they could get there. We actually went out about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So by now it's getting a little later. It's starting to get close to dark, and I hear the little Sandy aircraft. Now, the search aircraft that come in, there are 4 Sandys. They're A-1 aircraft. They're basically a World War II vintage aircraft, and they come in and actually protect. They're the close air support for the helicopters. Mm-hmm. And they have the little minigun zone that can put, you know, a shell every square inch for a baseball-sized field. So they are there to protect the helicopters. And they actually arrive before the helicopters do. So they were flying around above me, and I could hear them, and I was talking to them, and they were telling me how to get prepared, and the helicopters would be there just shortly. And about 7:30 or so, the helicopters finally arrived in the area. They went over to, I was on one side of the mountain, and Wally was on the other side of the mountain. They went over and they found Wally first because he was out in the open. His parachute was laying out on a big open area.
Right.
And they picked him up, and then they came over to the other side of the mountain where I was. And Wally's sitting in the door, and I could see the helicopters up there, and the helicopter comes, and it gets right above me, and I can watch it sitting there trying to hover. And the tree penetrator is just within grasp almost, and then the helicopter breaks off down the mountain.
So you're back on the radio.
I'm scared.
Yes.
You know, these guys are leaving, and they don't have me on that helicopter. So I grab my radio out and say, "Hey, guys, where are you going?" And they come back and say, "Oh, no sweat. We're going to go down the mountain, and we're going to dump some fuel because we're too heavy to hover at this altitude." And so I say, "Okay, great, I'll wait." So I wait, and about 10 minutes later, sure enough, here they come back. And the helicopter flies up, and it gets right above me, and it's sitting there trying to hover the tree penetrator. And I knew in my mind that if I could get one finger on that tree penetrator, I could go all the way back to South Vietnam hanging on one finger. But it just didn't quite get close enough. And the next thing I know, the helicopter is saying, and it goes back down the mountain. And I thought to myself, now, these guys are just going to dump more fuel, and they'll be back in just a moment. And so I didn't get my radio out, and I wait, and 5 minutes pass, and nothing. 10 minutes pass, and nothing. 20 minutes pass, and so now I'm starting to get worried because now it is dark. It's 8 o'clock at night, and it's dark. And I listen as all of the aircraft that had been flying overhead start to fly away, and they all disappear. So I grab the radio out, and not a soul will talk to me. Not a soul. Well, later I learned that radio had gone bad or broken during this period of time, and I wasn't able to hear any of the instructions or any of the things that any of the guys were telling me. And so here I was on a mountain by myself in North Vietnam, and it's dark, and I'm scared, but the Air Force has the same capability that so many organizations do. They pound certain things into your mind. And the one thing that they pounded into our brain is if we don't pick you up the first day, we'll be back at first light. First light. And so I pounded that into my mind, and I remember they're coming after me at first light.
So I want to fast forward here just a little bit. You know that they're coming after you because they've told you that is what that they will do, but meanwhile, you're spending the night on the side of that mountain. It starts to rain. It gets cold. The weather starts to deteriorate. But you make it through the night, and you make it to first light. Pick it up from there.
When the sun comes up, it was actually a beautiful morning. It was hard to think about being in a war zone because the sun came out, and for the first time, it warmed up. I started to get warm. I'd been shivering all night long. And the birds were singing. There were flowers growing around. There weren't a lot of tall trees because I was pretty high. Most of it was just ferns and moss and things. And so I stand there on the side of the mountain on this little clearing and start looking in the sky for the folks that are coming to get me. And this is 5 o'clock in the morning, and I'm looking down the mountain at the folks who might be coming after me. And of course, you know, this gave me a capability to understand how your mind can really do tricks on you. I was standing there, and I would be looking down the mountain, and I would see, oh, there comes a man. Oh, there he is. I see him, and I would take my eyes off and look back, and it'd be a stump. Mm. And so I tried to calm myself to the effect that, hey, don't let this, do anything crazy. And so I spent from 5 o'clock in the morning waiting for these guys who told me we'll be back at first light. But what they forgot to say is we're going to leave Thailand at first light, and we're in a helicopter making 90 miles an hour across Laos and all the way into North Vietnam. So it's going to be a while before we get there.
So it gets to be about 9 o'clock when
So
you
about
finally
9
hear
o'clock
something.
in the morning, all of a sudden, I hear an aircraft, and just about the time I hear aircraft, I see the fog coming in up the valley. And within 30 minutes, the fog is so bad, the clouds and the moisture is so thick that I could hold my hand out in front of my face and I couldn't see it. And the Sandy aircraft, the propeller-driven aircraft, had come back in the area, and they're flying up above me. Well, luckily, I reached down and I pulled out my other survival radio, and luckily I had that because I had been assigned as a squadron survival officer, and I had been trying to convince everyone to carry 2 radios.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did it simply because I was telling everyone else to, and luckily I had 2 radios because the other one was no good.
Right.
So I called and talked to the guys, and they gave me a lot of instructions, asked me why I hadn't gone down the mountain a couple of thousand feet. And I told them, well, I didn't know I was supposed to because I didn't hear anybody. And they told me, well, the helicopters are on their way. Just stay right where you are, and we'll attempt the rescue at this point.
So they do. They do get there, and the fog lifts for you.
Well, that's part of the whole thing. Is here I am. It's the helicopters finally get into the area, and I talked to the guys, and they said, well, I called them up and said, there's no way you guys are going to be able to get down in here. Don't even think about it because, you know, the weather was just so bad. The fog was so thick. And they said, well, the helicopters have about 10 minutes of hover time that they can stay in the area, wait to see what happens. And it was at this point that it finally, you know, and I don't want to say that it was anything dramatic. I didn't throw myself prostrate on the ground or anything, but it was at that point that I finally said to myself that, John, you've had all the training that you can get. You've done all the things that you're supposed to do. The Air Force has expended all this expense, the money and the manpower. Everyone has done everything that they can do. But here you can't see your hand in front of your face, and you've basically left one important aspect out of this whole scenario. And like I say, it was just something that came into my mind, and I said to myself, Lord, I need your help. And it wasn't probably 30 seconds later that I felt a breeze across my face. The fog lifted, and there was the helicopter directly above me. And they dropped the tree penetrator down, and I opened it up, strapped it around me, climbed onto the helicopter, and we exited the area. So now I'm a real happy camper. I'm excited. Man, things are going well for me.
But the adventure's not quite over
The adventure's
yet.
not quite over at that point. To try to calm me down, because they knew that I probably was pretty excited, which I really was, they sent me over by a window and gave me a headset. And now we still had a few 100 and so miles of North Vietnam and Laos to cross. And gave me a headset so I could listen to what's going on, and told me to look out the window to make sure nobody was attacking us. And I noticed a fluid flowing down the side of the helicopter, and I had the good sense to ask the guy, what is this? And he says, oh my gosh. And then the helicopter crew all got excited because it was the fluid out of the transmission that had a gasket that had broken. So the paramedic grabs me and puts me over by the door, puts a parachute on me, and says, now, if we have to jump out, said, I'm going to go with you, and I'll make sure your parachute opens before I open mine. And I told him, nope, I've already done that once. I don't need to do it again. Wherever the helicopter going, that's where I'm going to go. So they immediately started calling, and they found out that the Lima Site 101, which is where the Montagnard tribesmen actually lived, was friendly that day, or supposedly friendly. So we flew to the top of a mountain, basically, in northern Laos, and landed on this little grassy knoll that's up on top of the mountain. And as we came into land, I noticed a couple of guys out on the hill there, and found out later that they were the head tribesmen. And they had, after we landed, they insisted on meeting me because they disliked the North Vietnamese so much that they wanted to talk to me and simply say thank you. And so
you had a ceremony to attend.
we had a little ceremony, and the entire village filed past. And then one of the guys told me, he said, well, it's normal to give them a gift, and the only thing I had was a .38 pistol that the Air Force gave me for a signaling device because I couldn't hit anything with it. And so I gave that to the chief of the village, and it was very touching that they were appreciative of what we were trying to do.
So you get on another helicopter, and you get to relative safety, and then there's another ceremony.
Well, this one was the funny one because they put me on the helicopter and flew me into Udon, Thailand, and they were going to put me in the hospital there. And en route, of course, I had a medic with me. He told me that when we actually touched down, that there would be an ambulance there waiting on me. So when the helicopter touched down, I climbed out, still not knowing that I was hurt, and went over and climbed into the ambulance. And then about the time I climbed in, a colonel comes running over and says, hey, are you the Lieutenant Milholland that got shot down and rescued? I said, yes, sir. He said, well, you've got to come go through the ceremony. And so here I am now, coming out of the ambulance with a hurt back, not knowing it, going over and have to go shake all the colonel's hands, and so they can say, welcome home. But it was quite funny, the fact that it was more important to get the ceremony than it was to get me over to the hospital.
Need to fast forward here, but finally you get to the hospital and you find out that you do have injuries more serious than you thought that you had. You had broken bones in your back.
Yes, when they finally got me to the hospital and were able to do x-rays, found out that I had 3 compression fractures in my back. So I spent about the next 30 days tied to a bed until they made sure that none of them were going to be lasting injuries. And then finally, after I'd been at Udon for about a week, they sent me to Japan, and I was able to communicate with my family finally. And probably one of the things that we need to remember, that this was probably harder on my family, my mother, father, my wife's family, and especially my wife, because she had to face those 2 blue uniforms that knocked on the door.
Yeah.
And
John Milholland, Lieutenant John Milholland, it's a tough story to tell, but it's a very proud story to tell, and we thank you very, very much for your service.
well, I thank you, and I have to say I appreciate my wife for being with me for all these many years. And thank you for having me.
You bet. Lieutenant John Milholland, Vietnam War. Thank you, John Milholland, and please thank a veteran today. Next week, Glenn Morgan, bugler on the USS Indianapolis. It's quite a compelling story. For John Milholland, I'm Tom Turbyville. Thank you for watching Veterans of the Valley.
Come off okay? No, we still on?